Okay, so last week we looked at nausea, and we saw that at the heart of its structure was the question of the contingent nature of the world and the various ways in which people attempt to escape from that contingency by introducing an aspect of necessity to their worlds. And that could be through their projects, or it could be through a focus on the nature of knowledge or relationships to other people. Now, the text we'll be looking at today carries on this analysis of human psychology, but this time it looks at the role of the emotions in our lives. Now, what Sartre is going to claim here, essentially, is that emotions are a way of dealing with a situation where we find ourselves unable to practically engage with a situation. So emotions come into play when we can't act in a situation directly. So what we do is we change our perception of the situation rather than find an alternative course of action. And Sartre talks about this as a kind of magical transformation. And the idea is that the difficulty that was there before, that was preventing us from engaging in this situation, falls away when we reconceive of the situation in kind of magical terms, as he calls it. So we'll go through this in more detail as the lecture goes on, and hopefully this should get clearer. But here's a quick example that he gives later on in the text that I think explains the kind of the gist of what he's talking about. So here's what he says. He says, a simple example will serve to explain this emotive structure. I lift my hand to pluck a bunch of grapes. I cannot do so, they're beyond my reach. So I shrug my shoulders, muttering they are too green, and go on my way. The gestures and words and behaviours are not to be taken at face value. This little comedy that I play under the grapes, thereby conferring this quality of being too green upon them, serves as a substitute for the action I could not complete. Now this is a really simple case, as you can see. But we can see clearly the outlines of the structure of the account Sartre is going to put forward here. So we previously see something as desirable, we see the grapes as ready to be eaten, but we re-evaluate them as not worth eating once we realise that they're unobtainable. So Sartre's account is going to be a lot more sophisticated than this. And there are still lots and lots of questions that are unanswered by this example about what emotions actually consist of, and also about how, for instance, we move from one state to another. So is there a conscious decision here to move from a kind of rational understanding of the enjoyment of the grapes to the claim that they're too green? Or is it something that happens automatically, some sort of causal structure in the brain? Or is it something different from both of those? So we'll look at those kind of questions as well, what Sartre takes this transition between different states to be. Okay. So what I want to do today then, in setting out this account, is first of all I want to look at Sartre's account of phenomenology. Now, a lot of you guys might have come across phenomenology before. We'll be dealing with it in a bit more detail in the coming weeks, so I just want to give you an outline of some of the key features of Sartre's account here. But essentially what Sartre is doing is setting out his account of how we should engage in the emotions, and how philosophical inquiry differs from psychological inquiry, for instance. So I'll talk a little bit about Sartre's account of intentionality. Now that's the idea that consciousness isn't like a container that contains sense data, as you might find in, say, Descartes or Locke or Hume, but it's a way of relating to objects. So rather than a container, consciousness is a relation, a directedness. So we'll look at that before turning to Sartre's own account of the emotions. And I want to go through the sketch of the theory of the emotions in the following order. I want to begin by looking at the traditional accounts of emotion that Sartre puts forward. We'll work through most of those, briefly. And then after that, I'll turn to Sartre's positive account of emotions itself, and we'll explore how that account's put together and how Sartre thinks it overcomes the problems in the previous accounts. Okay. Okay, so you'll have seen that the sketch for the theory of the emotions begins with an analysis of the foundations of psychology. Now, what Sartre is going to argue is that in psychology there's an issue with the way we normally conceive of its foundations in terms of facts. Now, if you've looked at Heidegger before, you'll see a parallel here, hopefully, between what Sartre is claiming and some kind of Heideggerian stuff about the idea that we need to do ontology before we look at the kind of what actually goes on within different sciences. So you should see a parallel, therefore, with Heidegger's claim that we need to begin with phenomenology to give a clear understanding of our relationship to the world, and then once we've got that, we can get on and analyse the world in terms of particular facts. And we've then got a kind of a domain within which to place those facts to understand them properly. Now, what Sartre is going to argue is that there are a number of reasons why a fact-based understanding of psychology isn't going to do what we want. So if we take the idea of psychology as a science that gathers up facts and then synthesises them into a theory of the mind, there are a number of problems with this. So I want to go through three of these problems now. Okay. Okay, the first of these problems is, as I've hinted, that beginning with facts makes it really hard to circumscribe exactly what psychology is, and hence to circumscribe exactly what a human being is. So as Sartre says, what could be more different, for instance, than the study of the stroboscopic illusion and the study of the inferiority complex? So these are both aspects of a psychology, but they seem to be so far removed from each other that they have nothing in common. So human beings have got a kind of unity to their behaviour, which means that what Sartre is going to argue is that we can't understand the human being by simply collecting isolated facts, because what defines a human being is that the different aspects that make up their natures are all connected together. Now, all facts are, to an extent, on the same level. They're all accidental. They all could have been otherwise. Which means that we risk, when we begin from facts and try and build up a picture of what the human being is, we risk, for instance, understanding emotion as something that's a contingent aspect of what it is to be human, rather than something that's fundamental. So, if we begin with facts, we don't understand properly what's essential to the human condition and what's a purely accidental feature. Okay. Now this problem leads on to the second problem. So rather than beginning with facts, Sartre argues we need to begin with a proper understanding of the nature of human beings as they are in the world. So it's only once we've understood the structure of the human condition that we can make sense of facts. Now, the key to this claim is that if we're going to understand something like the emotions, we need to understand them in terms of their significance. Now, to have significance is to be meaningful, but it's also the case that for something to signify something, for something to have meaning, is for it to kind of relate to something else. You know, a sign signifies by pointing to something else. So to understand the human condition is to understand how all the parts kind of relate to each other and point to each other. So that's not something that isolated facts do. Isolated facts are by definition isolated. They don't have a natural relation to other facts. So by definition, if we begin from the facts, according to Sartre, we tend to miss the significance of the way in which they're all connected together. So here's what he says. We shall not begin by losing our way in the study of psychological facts, simply because, taken by themselves and in isolation, they signify almost nothing. They are, and that is all. On the contrary, we shall try, by developing the significance of behaviour and of disturbed consciousness, to explain what is signified. And what this is we know from the beginning. An emotion signifies, in its own manner, the whole of the consciousness, or if we take our stand on the existential plane, of the human reality. It is not an accident, because human reality is not a sum of facts. It expresses under a definite aspect, the synthetic human entirety in its integrity. So, if we try and understand emotion through looking at isolated facts and tying them together, we miss the fact that emotion is fundamental to the structure of the human as a whole, and it kind of can't be kind of compartmentalized to one aspect of what it is to be human. Okay, finally, and this is going to come up loads throughout the course, Sartre argues that the idea of a fact could be the site for an illusion. So we normally think of emotional states as relatively fixed things that extend beyond the present moment and, are the ground for their expression. So what I mean by that is if I hate Peter, for instance, then we'd normally understand the fact that I'm really revolted to see him at every particular instance as being grounded in a more long-lasted feeling towards him. So my hatred is responsible for the revulsion I feel every time he's in my presence. Now, what Sartre is going to argue is that when we've properly understood the nature of consciousness, we'll see that the feeling of revulsion relating to Peter is what's primary, and the idea that I hate him is an extrapolation from those individual instances, and it's just a way of making sense of those moments. But as he talks about properties later on, it extends beyond what's given. It kind of takes the hatred to be a fixed thing, whereas in fact it's an extrapolation that goes beyond the particular instances it covers. It becomes like a fixed property of me that I hate Peter, whereas in fact what I have are these series of moments of revulsion. Now, what that means is that hatred, therefore, becomes a way of making sense of these aspects of revulsion rather than a cause of them. If we begin with facts, therefore, we risk taking what's an effect of those moments of revulsion, which is the hatred, for being a cause of those moments. And that means that we'll have a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of consciousness. So beginning with facts may lead us into more difficulties than we need, and it may prevent us from ever properly understanding the nature of something like emotion. So like I say, we're going to look at this in a lot more detail throughout the course, and it's going to be central to a lot of what happens in Being and Nothingness. But Sartre's potential point is that if we begin with a fact, we might implicitly bring in a model of human nature that actually prevents us from developing a proper understanding of the emotions. Okay. So Sartre considers a number of prior theories of the emotions that I want to go through today. We'll go through them, or most of them. We'll leave the psychoanalytic theory for a few weeks' time when we look at bad faith. But there are a number that I quickly want to go through here, and we can list them as follows. The first of them is called the peripheric theory, and it's normally attributed to William James, and it holds that emotions are effects in consciousness of bodily states. Now, you'll see throughout the text and throughout my explanation of it today that there's a kind of dialectic going on here. So Sartre will take up a theory, he'll show that it doesn't work, and he'll present a more complicated theory, and then he'll show that that doesn't work, and then there'll be a more complicated theory, and so on. So Janet's theory comes out of the failures, in a sense, for Sartre, of William James's account. And essentially, it's a theory that emotions are ways of moving from high energy behaviour to low energy behaviour when we realise that the goals of those high energy behaviours are going to be thwarted. So it's a kind of causal theory of the subject. So we'll then go on and look at what's known as Gestalt theory, Gestalt psychology, and the figure Sartre concentrates here is a guy called Dembo. And what Dembo argues is that emotions are a solution to a problem that we can't rationally solve. So when we encounter a difficulty that can't be dealt with, we reconceive the situation in such a way that certain constraints on our behaviour beforehand fall away. So as we'll see, if you're unable to do something, you might, because of the rules, you might get angry so that you begin to see the rules as things that are stupid, banal, nonsensical, and then that allows you to act in a way that you couldn't before. Because suddenly the constraints are reconceived from being perfectly reasonable constraints to being things that are stupid, so we can ignore them. So in that way, emotions provide a solution to a problem that we couldn't solve before by reconceiving of the world. Okay, the final theory, and we're not really going to look at this too much today, is psychoanalytic theory. So that's Sigmund Freud's theory of the emotions, and the essential claim is going to be that emotions are a symbolic realization of repressed drive. So we've got a drive to do something, probably something a bit naughty if it's Freud, and because we can't do that due to societal constraints, etc., 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 or we have a trauma in the past that we can't express because it's too painful. So we either express those drives or those constraints in an emotional manner in consciousness. But the meaning of those emotions is driven by some unconscious significance. So we'll explain that. I'll explain that to you when we come to it. All right. So let's run through the different theories. The peripheric theory of the emotions holds that emotions are essentially mental correlates of changes in the physiological state of the body. So we don't say, if we hold to the peripheric theory, that we cry because we're sad, but rather we're sad because we cry. Now here's a brief account of William James's presentation of the justification for this theory. Okay, if we fancy some strong emotion and then try to abstract from our consciousness of it all the feelings of its characteristic bodily symptoms, we find we have nothing left behind, no mind stuff out of which the emotion can be constituted. And that a cold, neutral state of intellectual perception is all that remains. What kind of an emotion of fear would be left if the feelings neither of the quickened heartbeats, nor the shallow breathing, neither of the trembling lips, nor the weakened limbs, neither of the goose flesh, nor the visceral stirrings were present? It is quite impossible to think. Can one fancy the state of rage and picture no abolition of it in the chest, no flushing of the face, no dilation of the nostrils, no clenching of the teeth, no impulse to vigorous action, but in their stead limp muscles, calm breathing, and a placid face? The present writer, for one, certainly cannot. The rage is as completely evaporated as the sensation of its so-called manifestations. So when we actually look at what emotions are, we find all it is a certain set of physiological reactions. And when we consider it more carefully, when we like really seriously think, then when we take all of those away, there's no emotion left. Okay. Now the advantages of this theory, I think, should be relatively clear. And that's that it's able to explain emotion purely in facts that are available to analysis, such as the state of the body. Nonetheless, there are quite a number of obvious problems with this theory. And Sartre notes a number of them. I just want to pick up a couple of them here that we can look at. First, quite often emotions that would appear to have a kind of difference in kind between them only show a difference in degree when we look at the physiological response we feel. So the same physiological changes, for instance, we could say occur in joy and anger, a quickening of the heartbeat, ebullition of the chest, flushing of the face. All of these things occur. So joy to a certain case, and then even more intensely when we're dealing with anger. But we wouldn't want to say that the difference between anger and joy was just a difference in degree. We would want to say that there's a difference in kind between a feeling of joy and a feeling of anger. So they're qualitatively different. Now, perhaps more importantly, we can note that we often find that we experience different emotions even though our physiological state is the same. Now, I think like a clearer example of this, and we'll look at this once again, we'll look at this later in the course, is the notion of guilt and shame. So we might believe, and I think this would be quite a reasonable belief, that our physiological state when we're feeling guilt and shame is exactly the same. So what separates one from the other? Well, it would seem to be something like that guilt is a feeling internal to ourselves, something about our own behaviour, whereas shame is felt in relation to other people. So we feel ashamed when we think about how others will see us or how others do see us. Now, that distinction between guilt and shame seems to be impossible to capture if we're simply going to understand emotions as a physiological set of expressions, set of feelings. Okay, well, if the peripheric theory doesn't work, can we develop a theory that does take into account our intentions? Now, Janet's theory instead operates in terms of behaviour and argues that emotion occurs when a particular mode of behaviour proves too difficult for the subject. Now, Janet's account is going to be essentially a mechanistic account here. He's going to see the psyche as essentially a system of energy where the failure of a given behaviour to kind of discharge energy leaves the psyche to find an alternative sort of suboptimal way of discharging that energy. So emotion is kind of like a safety mechanism in the event of a failure of our properly adaptive behaviour to relate to circumstances. So Janet gives the following example. He says, when the task is too difficult and we cannot maintain the better behaviour appropriate to it, the psychic energy that has been released expends itself along another path. We adopt an inferior behaviour that necessitates lesser psychic tension. In his work on obsession and psychasthenia, Janet cites the case of several patients who, having come to make confessions to him, could not finish their confessions but broke down in tears, sometimes even bringing on a nervous crisis. Here again, the required behaviour is too difficult. The weeping or the nervous crisis represents a behaviour of defeat, which substitutes itself for the former by a deviation. The point needs no elaboration and examples are abundant. So that's the basic idea. We want to perform a behaviour. Our psychic system is all ready to do so. It finds it's impossible to do so, so it finds another way of discharging that energy from the emotion through a suboptimal, subadaptive behaviour in relation to the situation. So the patient comes to Janet, she's got a problem, but she can't express that problem, so she breaks down in tears, which is a suboptimal way of dealing with the situation of being confronted by the psychologist or psychiatrist. Now, the difficulty with this approach is that Janet wants to provide an account purely in terms of behaviour, and it seems to be the case that what we have here is a kind of automatic response. So the patient can't make the confession they want to make, so there's an automatic fallback to a kind of behaviour that's a suboptimal response. Now, Janet wants to explain this purely in terms of mechanism, but it seems clear that we need to explain the behaviour of the patients in terms of intentions once again. So Sartre notes in these cases, the patients don't seem to be crying because they can say nothing, but they seem to be crying in order to say nothing. So it's not that there's a kind of shift, an automatic safety valve shift, but rather the behaviour of crying in front of Janet is a way of forestalling the confession. Now that seems to require more than a behaviourist understanding of emotion, because we need to see some kind of intention behind it, as well as the recognition of the possibility of talking, we've got the recognition of we've got the rejection of that possibility. The patient recognises that they they should talk, and they have a strategy that prevents that situation of talking occurring, which seems to be a much more intentional account than the purely mechanistic account Janet wants to develop. Okay, final theory that I want to look at is that of Gestalt psychology. Now this puts, perception at least, back at the heart of the analysis of the emotions. Gestalt psychology is interested in the way in which our perception organises the world, and it focuses on the way in which this organisation takes place not simply through atomic elements, as you might find with, say, sense data of Hume or Locke that are kind of put together, but in terms of laws for the interrelation of elements that actually constitute what the basic elements of perception themselves are. So, the classic example of this, I think, is the optical illusion. And Gestalt psychology means form, so it's the importance, in a sense, of form over the elements. Now, optical illusions are important because the form we see isn't governed directly by the elements, but by the way in which the elements are related together. So if we look at this image, for instance, we can see a circle and a rectangle. But what we actually see is a collection of small lines. So in effect, the whole is more than the sum of the parts here. The way that those lines and elements are juxtaposed together is what leads us to see the form. And it's the juxtaposition that's important rather than the elements themselves. I mean, that's a bit simplistic, but you kind of get where they're going with that. Now, as I say, the important point here is that the way in which perception is constituted now extends beyond the parts that make it up. And this puts the subject at the heart of our account of the emotions. Because presumably the subject organises the perceptual field in some way, the phenomenal field. Now, Sartre describes the following experiment from the Gestalt psychologist Dembo. He says, let's take the simplest example. We ask a subject to reach for an object placed upon a chair, but without putting a foot outside a circle traced on the ground. The distances are so calculated as to make the act very difficult or impossible by direct means, but the problem can be resolved by indirect means. Here, the force directed towards the object takes on a clear, concrete meaning. On the other hand, these problems present an obstacle to direct execution of the action, an obstacle that may be either material or moral, for instance, a rule one has undertaken to observe. Thus, in our example, the circle that one must not overstep presents to the perception of the subject a barrier from which there emanates a force directly in opposition to the former, to the subject. The conflict between these two forces sets up a tension in the phenomenal field. So, you draw a circle, you can't get outside the circle, but you have to get to the object. And the line that you draw sort of exerts a force on consciousness once it's recognised as a line that we're not supposed to cross. So it's in the same way that if you play chess and you look at a chessboard, you don't just see the pieces, but when you look at the knight, you kind of implicitly see the directionality, the places where the individual chess pieces could move if you wanted to move them. In a certain sense, that's present to you when you're looking at the board, as well as the individual elements. So when we draw the line and say you have to reach for the object, but you can't go outside the circle, the line of the circle exerts a force on us because it It represents a limit to what we can do. So we've got this situation here, though, where there's a tension between the rules that we accept and the goal that we've been given. Now, we can't complete the goal because the rules prevent us from doing so. But anger is a way in which we can reconceive the relations between the elements that make it up in order to make the problem solvable. So here's what Sartre says. Prolongation of the ordeal may end in emotional disorders or in other, still more primitive ways of liberating tensions. The fits of anger, sometimes very violent, which supervene in certain persons, have been capably studied in the work of T. Tembo. The situation undergoes a structural simplification. In anger, and doubtless in all the emotions, there is a weakening of the barriers that separate the deeper and more superficial levels of the self, which normally ensure regulation of action by the deep personality and maintain self-control. A weakening of the barriers between the real and the unreal. Okay, so what happens then is that we find we can't resolve the problem given its current formulation. So anger allows us to reconceive of the situation in a simpler manner by removing some of the constraints that prevented us from finding the solution. So anger might result in a storming out of the experiment, for instance, or calling the constraints stupid or arbitrary. And in that way, we simplify the situation and we find a way of making it solvable. Now, Sartre thinks this is a good account of what actually happens. When we have a hard time dealing with a difficult situation, what happens often is that the emotions step in to allow us to re-describe it in a way that gives us a solution to our problems. Now, what Gestalt psychology doesn't explain is the reason for this shift between one moment and another. So all we've got here really is two different moments. We've got one where we experience a particular organisation of the world, and a second where that organisation is replaced by a simpler organisation. What we don't have really is an account of the motivation between the 2 points. Okay. So the second main account that Sartre deals with after those classical, what he calls the classical models, the second type of account he gives is psychoanalysis. Now, psychoanalysis sees the origins of behaviour and the emotions as being in the unconscious. So emotions are generated when we have a drive in the unconscious that cannot be satisfied. What happens in that case is that the drive is expressed in terms of another form of behaviour that gives us a kind of symbolic satisfaction of that desire. So here's an example that Sartre gives. So he says, there's that woman with a phobia for laurel. If she sees a clump of laurels, she faints. The psychoanalyst discovers that in her childhood there was a painful sexual incident associated with laurel bushes. What will be the corresponding emotion? A phenomenon of refusal and censorship. Not refusal of the laurel itself, but a refusal to relive the memory connected with laurels. Here the emotion is a flight from revelation to follow, from the revelation to follow, as sleep is sometimes a flight from a decision to be taken. And as the illnesses of certain young women are, according to Steckel, a flight from marriage. So, here we've got an account where we have a fainting fit that prevents the young woman reliving a prior experience of some horrible experience she's had that she associates with these laurel bushes, and she doesn't want to relive the experience because she doesn't want to allow the trauma to come to the surface. The emotion is a way of preventing self-censorship. Now, we're not going to look in detail at Sartre's criticisms of psychoanalysis here, because we'll be coming back to them in a few weeks when we look at bad faith. And that's where I think, well, maybe not his main engagement, but his most famous engagement with psychoanalysis lies. In brief, though, what Sartre is going to argue is that psychoanalysis essentially posits the idea of emotions that we're not conscious of, but also posits that the conscious mind is now seen as essentially an effect of the unconscious, where the unconscious is where the significance of what happens takes place. But given consciousness is entirely cut off from the unconscious, it becomes difficult to see how the psychoanalytic method could change unconscious drives on the basis of a discussion of consciousness itself. So, if we see consciousness as entirely unaware of what's going on in the unconscious, it's difficult to see how the psychoanalytic process could lead one to change one's unconscious desires on the basis of a discussion of conscious facts. Now, we can talk about that in more detail. It's a little bit controversial, what Sartre says there, but we'll come back to that when we look at bad faith. Okay, so I now want to turn to Sartre's positive account of the emotions. Now, what Sartre is going to argue is that behaviour and physiological response, so all the things we've been looking at, are intimately connected to the emotion, but really behaviours are made possible by our emotional response to the world. So Sartre notes here that emotions are understood as generated by a perception for traditional theories. But we then understand an emotion as a mental state that we're kind of reflectively aware of. Now, rather than a mental state, what Sartre is going to argue is that emotions are best understood as ways that we conceive of the world. So to see why he thinks this is the case, we can look at how we understand the world when we're engaged in it in a normal, practical manner. Now, as Sartre says, we often understand our engagement in the world as, we traditionally understand it rather, as involving a movement between reflection and non-reflection. So, for instance, when faced with a problem, I might reflectively consider it, reflect on the possible solutions, and then I may put a solution in place which I then unreflectively follow. So there's a deliberative, reflective attitude, and then there's a kind of performative aspect that may be non-reflective. Now, Sartre instead claims that most of the time we're in the world without any reference to the self whatsoever. Instead, we're driven by objects and events that themselves call for a response without the ego being involved. So I've given you here a passage from another text. You can find similar passages to this in the sketch for the theory, but this I think is Sartre's earliest mature writing really, and it's the transcendence of the ego. And here's an account of how we relate to the world in kind of practical terms. So here's what he says. When I run after a streetcar, when I look at the time, when I'm absorbed in contemplating a portrait, there is no I. There is consciousness of the streetcar having to be overtaken, etc., and non-positional consciousness of consciousness. In fact, I am then plunged into a world of objects. It is they which constitute the unity of my consciousness. It is they which present themselves with values, with attractive and repellent qualities. But me, I have disappeared. I have annihilated myself. There is no place for me on this level. And this is not a matter of chance due to a momentary lapse of attention, but happens because of the very structure of consciousness. Now, in this example, we don't have the same separation between evaluation and perception that we find in traditional accounts. Rather, perception contains within itself certain values that lead us to behave in certain ways. You know, we see the streetcar as having to be overtaken. We don't think about needing to overtake it. We just see it in relation to a certain form of action. So we don't have the same separation here between perception and the reaction to it, And what happens here for Sartre? What's going to be the role of emotion? It's not simply going to be a reflective state, but it's going to be something that intervenes when our projects prove to be too difficult in the face of the world. Now, we don't have a change in emotional state. We don't have a reflective entity in our mind here, but instead we have a change in the object itself. So he says, now we can conceive what an emotion is. It's a transformation of the world. When the paths before us become too difficult, or when we cannot see our way, we can no longer put up with such an exacting and difficult world. All ways are barred, and nevertheless we must act. So we try to change the world, that is, to live it as though the relations between things and their potentialities were not governed by deterministic processes, but by magic. But be it well understood, this is no playful matter. We are cornered and we fling ourselves into this new attitude with all the force at our command. Note also that our effort is not conscious of what it is, for then it would be an object of reflection. It is above all the seizure of new relationships and new demands. Okay. So there are a number of points that we can make even from this short passage here. So as with the previous accounts, emotions here intervene when a course of behaviour is too difficult. And they do so by changing the way we conceive of the world, from being a world governed by the kinds of causal connections that make our projects possible, to a new way of relating the world together. Finally, this transition doesn't involve a conscious choice, and I'll give two examples here of how we might use emotion to escape from a situation. So the first of these is passive fear, where one faints in a dangerous situation, and the second is going to be passive sadness. So these should hopefully clarify a bit what Sartre is talking about here. So take, for example, passive fear. I see a ferocious beast coming towards me. My legs give way and under me. My heart beats more feebly. I turn pale. I fall down and faint away. No conduct could seem worse adapted to the danger than this, which leaves me defenceless. And nevertheless, it is a behaviour of escape. The fainting away is a refuge. But let no one suppose that it is a refuge for me, that I am trying to save myself or to see no more of the ferocious beast. I have not come out of the non-reflective plane, but, being unable to escape the danger by normal means and deterministic procedures, I have denied existence to it. I have tried to annihilate it. So we escape danger here by kind of magical thinking. We make the beast, the ferocious beast, disappear. But we can't just make the beast disappear. It's a kind of escape. But the only way we can make the beast disappear is by also making our consciousness of it disappear. So turning pale and fainting is a way of annihilating consciousness along with the beast. So behaviour here is a way of responding to the situation, but it's a way of responding to the situation as signified and presented in an emotional state. So the fainting, in a sense, belongs to the world that's been reconfigured by emotions' replacement of the deterministic relations, where if I faint, the ferocious beast will eat me, to another set of magical relations where, in a sense, I make the beast disappear through my emotional state. Okay, so fainting then is a way of escaping from the situation, or negating, annihilating the situation. Now, as Sartre says, this doesn't involve the subject. So I'm not thinking, if I make the beast go away, I'll be safe. It's an entirely non-reflective action, where the annihilation of consciousness, the fainting, is purely the means by which we annihilate the situation. Okay, the second example is passive sadness. So it's a bit of a long example, this, but we'll go through it now. Passive sadness is characterised, as we know, by dejected behaviour. There is a muscular relaxation, paleness and cold at the extremities. One turns away towards some corner to sit there motionless, making the least possible contact with the world. One prefers twilight to full daylight, silence to sound, and solitude to one's room, in one's room to frequented roads and public places. To be alone, they say, with one's sorrow. But cases in which sorrow is really cherished are rather rare. There is quite another reason. One of the accustomed conditions of our activity has vanished, yet we are still required to act in and upon the world without it. Most of the potentialities of our world, work to be done, people to see, duties of daily round to be accomplished, remain the same. Only the means for realising them, the paths traced over our hodological space, have changed. If, for example, I have just learned that I am ruined, I no longer dispose of the same means, a private car, etc., to accomplish them. I shall have to substitute means new to me, taking the motor bus, etc., which is precisely what I do not want to do. My melancholy is a method of suppressing the obligation to look for these new ways by transforming the present structure of the world, replacing it with an entirely undifferentiated structure. So the kind of the flatness of affect that we find with depression, for instance, the idea that everything in the world is the same as everything else, the greyness to it, emerges from an attempt on the part of consciousness to remove the need to act when our circumstances change, when the previous ways in which we would solve the problems of our lives, going to work, etc., those don't no longer function, and we need to find new solutions to living. Now, to prevent ourselves from having to do that, we enter a depressive state where all actions are equally valuable. So we remove the need to find new ways of solving life's problems by, in effect, removing those problems themselves, by seeing the whole life as grey and undifferentiated, and nothing therefore as being worth doing. So the behaviour, the paleness, the sort of flatness of affect, are appropriate responses to the situation that we find ourselves in, which is determined by an unreflective change in the way the situation appears. So given the world now appears to be grey, undifferentiated, etc., etc., then these tendencies to make the least contact with the world, to appear motionless, the paleness, the faint heartbeat, all of these are appropriate responses to the world as we find it once emotion has transformed it into this new structure. Okay, so that's all I want to deal with really today in terms of the emotions. And we can talk about all of these aspects in more detail in the seminars. A couple of things you might want to think about. First, this seems like a very interesting account of dealing with negative emotions, anger, fear, trauma, all of these situations like fainting, where we're kind of presented with things that disrupt our normal relation to the world. But you might want to ask if this is such a good theory when we look at things like joy, happiness, contentment. Does it work in the same way in these cases? Second, I think something that I do want to talk about is how this relates to the discussion you'll find at the end of the sketch, where Sartre starts to talk about emotions that aren't elicited by our own projects, but are elicited by sort of things that we find in the world itself. So he talks about, this sort of classic, almost Hitchcockian moment of like the face appearing at the window, and the horror by which we kind of step back from it. So those cases, the kind of cases you find, horror is the easiest example. Those kind of psychological jumps and the feeling of being unnerved in the haunted house. These kind of cases don't seem to fit well either with the idea that emotion are a response to our projects being thwarted, because here the world itself seems to elicit a transformation in our attitude to it. So Sartre does talk about these cases, so I want to talk a little bit as well about whether these other cases fit well or badly with the account we've been looking at. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. Bye.